Welcome back to another episode of Noob to Pro, the series where we cover Valorant fundamentals to help you climb the rank ladder. Today, we're going to give you tips on how to lead your team to victory by calling strats to secure rounds. Now let's get right into it. First, let's go over a few key words and phrases that are must-knows when it comes to Valorant strategies and shot calling. An in-game leader, or IGL, is the player who calls what to do during a game. They lead their team through making calls like basic strategies, defensive setups, or even mid-round decision-making that affects the team as a whole. Things like, let's stop making noise for 30 seconds and then go B. It is a crucial role for pro play, and it can be extremely useful for getting a team organized and performing at their best and ranked as well. Famous IGLs include NRG's FNS and Fnatic's Boaster, both of whom have led their teams to international trophies. An IGL is responsible for calling how to set up to adapt to the opposing team's gameplay, and their role in pro play is often not only very important in the hour they're playing the map, but also outside of it too. They're not only in-game leader, but also oftentimes captain. They decide what they as a team collectively want to work on and how they're going to go about doing it too. So knowing that, it should come as no surprise that in ranked, it's generally a much more informal role, where it's more of anyone who's more confident or willing to read the game and lead the troops. Not every ranked team will have an in-game leader, and you shouldn't always expect the 4 random teammates to want to spend their free time listening to your calls either. But if you have a good leader and a team that's willing to listen, your chances of winning are certainly going to go up. Another key concept, defaulting, refers to a team strategy where you don't commit to anything too specific right away, but instead get as much map control as you safely can while gathering information and holding for enemy pushes. A default generally looks like this: a setup where an attacking team is spread out across the map to see how the defenders are positioned. You'd want to run a default whenever you're faced with some element of unpredictability from the enemy that is costing you rounds, or if you just want to figure out how your opponents play and what kind of weaknesses they may have. For example, they might have a Cypher that moves their setup around constantly, making it very hard for your Jet to dash into sight without getting caught on a tripwire and dying. Alternatively, they could also have a very good operator player that could be holding an angle and you want to find out where they are first so that you can avoid them. Or maybe they're basically playing retake on a site every round, and you're only able to realize this by getting some more information and seeing what's happening around the map. The natural question you may have is, why not just try to push somewhere and then change your mind and rotate? That's where the map control part of this comes in. The danger with stacking all 5 of your teammates in one area is that the enemies are free to roam around the rest of the map as they may please, including behind you. There are a million different angles to clear between the site you're at and the next bomb site, and any one of which could have a hiding enemy defender or 2. If you and your teammates decide you want to rush A on ascent and you all group up 5 main, this can of course have success, but if you're stopped early, the enemies hear steps, a sage wall goes up, you break it, slows come in, then a molly, then a smoke. Well, now you're just kind of stuck, and you just wasted 20 to 25 seconds. And because all 4 of your teammates are right there with you, you really have no idea if the enemies are pushed up mid, if they just took B main, maybe they even pushed outside of B main. Are the enemies in your spawn? You really have no way to tell. It's good to realize that the 5-man rush plays have a place, but it's not a flawless strategy, and it's not something you should do without a good reason or idea supporting it. Similar to a default in some ways, but distinctly different, is a ranked classic named playing for picks. In the same way as before, you're spreading out across the map, but this time you're actively searching for an opening kill or pick. So instead of gathering information to find a weak spot in the defender's setup, you're really just trying to create weaknesses by getting that all-important first blood. Managed to get a pick? Great. Now the enemies are forced to spread thinner as they have to watch more things with fewer players. So you can group up slowly with your team and try to hit a site without giving away too much information. Playing for picks generally works pretty well, since most players are able to go for their favorite solo plays that they developed in their time playing ranked. But it's also risky. There's not so much teamwork involved, and if everyone is losing their duels, there's obviously not too much of a point of doing it. Playing contact or contacting somewhere refers to hiding from enemy utility. It basically means not showing your presence and slowly shifting towards a site until you're spotted, at which point you are free to commit to a loud push. It's an extremely helpful way to counteract fast rotating enemies. If you know your opponents are playing reactive and tend to wait for you to give them some information to react off of, then this could be a very good strategy. If enemies are playing retake or very passive, you can sometimes even walk all the way into sites. Ordinarily, you'd tell your team to contact up A, for example, but it's often the case that people don't know what the term means, especially if you reside in the lower half of the ranks. So instead, telling them to not make any sound and hide from utility should get the point across. By hiding right up until the moment you explode onto the site, the players from the other side are unlikely to immediately rotate since they don't have any information. The downside of playing like this is that the enemy team can peek out into you aggressively or hold you with an AWP, and you won't be using utility like a drone to clear them out. And finally, stacking a site means that you have a majority of your players on one site to gamble that the enemies will commit there. It's a common play for an economy round where your chances of winning the round is lower anyway. Simply let your team know that you want to stack the site you think the enemies are attacking and you're good to go. Just make sure to not give away the large number of players on the site too early, since the enemy team could rotate if they realize they're running into a stack. Pick a corner to hide in and swing out all at once to crush the enemy execution onto site. Before I forget, I just quickly want to mention that if you're serious about Valorant and you want to improve as fast as possible, we highly advise you check out our one-on-one coaching, as well as our exclusive guides and boot camps over on our website, ProGuides.com. Everything's available for just $8 a month. Now for the agents. The first thing we can look at when loading into a game is team composition. In ranked, you obviously have a very limited control over what your team plays. You can ask for which agent you want, of course, but chances are there will be a couple of insta-lockers. Don't worry though, you can make anything work with the right plays. If you want more help on which agents are good on which map, we've got plenty of guides for you to check out for you to watch after this video. As soon as you load in, take a look at which agents are on the enemy team as well as yours. And first thing you should check for are any obvious missing roles that you can exploit. If there's no controller, you can hold with an operator from far back angles. If there's no initiator, you can sit in corners with a judge. If they have no sentinel, you'll have a much easier time flanking or lurking. Make a note of what you can take advantage of immediately and let your team know so that they're also aware of the possibilities open to them. Another thing to think about is agent counters. Some agents are designed to combat the dominance of others. For example, KO is the perfect counter against agents who rely on their utility to hold down sites on their own. For example, Cypher or Killjoy. Cypher in turn is a perfect counter for an agent like Neon that would want to quickly explode onto the site. If you find an agent to be too oppressive, try finding out which utility can maneuver around their setup and counteract it. If you're missing multiple agents' roles and you have to fill, remember that you always need a controller first, then an initiator, and lastly a sentinel. So now that you've looked at your team compared to the enemies, it's time to make a plan. Generally speaking, there are 3 options at the start of a round on attack. You can rush into a site, play contact, or default / playing for picks. How you play these rounds should be determined by a few different factors: your economy compared to the enemy teams, the ultimates available, and any tendencies you've noticed from the enemy team. Let's look at each of these in turn. When looking at the enemy team's economy, you want to check a couple of different things. Can they all buy rifles with armor? If a couple of them can't, then it's probably the case that the entire team is saving. If the enemy team is saving, then it's a good idea to stick together as much as possible. That way, if someone does happen to lose their 1v1 against an eco-round weapon, they have a teammate nearby to either trade them out or at the very least safeguard the weapon to prevent the enemy team from getting it. You also want to check to see if the opposing team can buy an operator, particularly on the part of traditional operator playing agents like Jet or Chamber. If they can, you can take it as a sign to proceed with a little bit more caution and clear angles with utility before peeking. Also note that just because you're sticking together when the opponent's got an eco doesn't mean you're rushing onto a site. You should still be worried about stacks, so don't commit to anything too hard. Ultimate abilities are called that for a reason. They can turn the tide of an entire round in seconds, and they can really push the enemies up against it. So our advice to you is to check which ultimates you have available as well as your opponents to determine the shape of a round before it even starts. For example, if you're on defense and you have the Killjoy's ultimate available, you can stack a site and play retake on the other. Just make sure to leave someone near the site to gather information and make sure the attackers don't take too much space in your spawn. The same concept goes for attack. Decide which side to attack and what to do based on which ultimates you can use to take the space in a safer and more effective manner. Again, as an aspiring IGL, it'll be your job to check which ultimates are available across both teams in order to decide how you want the round to go. So what's the play? Rush, contact, maybe default? Generally speaking, you want to play a default. A default in a strategy sense is the same as the default in a settings sense. It's kind of the standard way of playing. If you have no particular thing you want to do, no particular read you've made, or specific play you want to go for, you should probably just default. Defaulting gives you a lot of information, and if you run a default a couple of times, you can get a very good idea of the enemy's tendencies very quickly. Once you notice something specific, you can make a play according to it. See your enemies are playing very passive over on A? You can go for a contact play. Found out your enemies are playing Arena as a solo anchor on B? Rush that site. Did you realize that your team is terrible at playing a default and they need you to hold their hand or else they'll simply lose all their duels? Well, maybe you're forced to rush or contact on the sites for the rest of the game, even with lacking information, but the very least you can do is focus on your ultimate economy to try and play around that. Now, we should mention that in ranked, players are broken records. They do the same thing over and over and over again. So if you notice a player constantly repeating themselves round after round, make sure to punish them for it. It's the IGL's job to spot tendencies and let the team know that they want to stop it. For example, if an enemy killjoy is lurking mid completely on their own every time while the rest of their team pushes the sites, telling your team to focus on pushing mid to get control and overwhelm that solo player can get you an easy first pick, and it can put you in a prime position to retake without having to worry about splitting resources to watch the flank. The same concept applies when the opposing team is repeatedly rushing the same site. Don't be afraid to stack a site and retake the other. It's pointless trying to allocate the same resources every round when you know it's not enough. Remember, it's like Einstein supposedly said, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again expecting different results. So change things up if they don't work. Calling plays mid-round can be the hardest thing to do as an IGL. You need to use the information you gather from a range of sources including the minimap and your team's comms to decide what your team should do. What you should be taking note of is the enemy utility in particular to find out where they're playing on defense or where they intend to push on attack. As a result, you can use this information to either determine where your team should execute on attack, or if your team should push the site or rotate on defense. Let's take defending on ascent for example. You and a teammate are playing on B while 3 other teammates are towards the A site and they have information on 4 enemies around main. The best play here would be to carefully start clearing B main with your teammate and pushing the flank towards A. This will have the effect of gaining map control for the team and any lurkers will be caught in a 2v1. The same concept applies on attack. If you're running a default and you see 3 enemies use their abilities towards A site, a smart play would be to call your teammates back up to group up and hit B so that you can run the numbers advantage. Of course, your enemies have legs and brains as well. They can read your read, make plays and reactions themselves, or just cause some funny rank moments to happen. But the more experience you'll get, the better you'll become at reading the game, and thus ultimately calling strategies as well. We're approaching the end of the round and it's time to do one of 2 things. Either retake the site and defuse the spike, or defend the site from those defenders coming to defuse the spike. Now is when time management comes into play. If you're an attacker playing a post-plant defending role, most of the time your primary objective will be to try and waste as much time as possible, so that way there isn't enough time left for the spike to be defused. But that isn't always the case. As a general rule, if you're down on numbers, then you should be playing a little bit more aggressively to even the odds before playing back and wasting time. And the opposite holds true as well. If you're up on numbers, then hold positions from which you can trade your teammates and just run down the clock. Your role as an IGL will be to make sure your team is doing the right thing in the right situation. Remember that getting kills is no priority here, securing the round is. If that means letting the enemy kill you to waste enough time for them to be unable to stick the defuse, then you've done a great job. If you need that pick before you can play back and hold angles, then tell your team that's what you want them to do and ask them to come with you to push and kill one, sometimes even before you decide to get the spike down. If you're attempting to retake a site, it's very important that you make sure your team is a coordinated unit. Don't be afraid to ask for utility you want used when retaking and let your team know what you intend on doing before going into the site. For example, you could say something like Omen smoke short, or Sova can you dart close left and KO flash left. Too often, players tend to see a round as over when the attackers have planted the spike, and that could not be further from the truth. The real fight is just beginning, and the more cohesive you are as a team, the better your chances. If it happens to be the case that your team is low on money going into the next round and your prospects aren't looking good, for example, if the enemy team outnumbers yours by 2 players or more, don't be afraid to cut your losses and save your weapons for the next round. You'll have a better chance of winning the next round with your 2 rifles going into it than you would be attempting a 2v5 on this round and having a full save the next. Finally, we'll wrap up with some advice on how to communicate clearly and effectively with your team. When giving information, make sure to be as specific as needed about what you see. For example, if Sova is droning into your site, be sure to say that instead of 1B or even worse, just B. That way if he's spotted later in the round towards A, we know that he made a decision to rotate away from B, meaning that it's unlikely to be a push towards that site. Your teammates often will give you comms of that quality back, so it can be helpful to ask them what's happening on the other side of the map so that you have the same information that they do. A simple question of, have you seen Omen? Or are they committing to the site? Before deciding what to do can go a long way towards stopping lurks or fakes from catching you off guard. A lot of the time, it can be hard to get your team to respond to your calls. You're not an official in-game leader after all, just someone picking up the role for this game. The best way to encourage and motivate your team into action is by briefly providing the reasoning behind everything you want to do. For example, for the situation we described earlier, you can say, there are 3 on A and only 2 B. Let's push B and play trades. By just saying something like rotate, your teammates might not respect the call and see it as a random decision. Demonstrating solid reasoning when calling strategies in ranked can make it a lot easier to get your teammates to listen to you next time. But of course, also be mindful when you're doing it. If your teammate is heavily fighting in mid and really needs to hear sound, there's a very real chance that they might not appreciate you holding your podcast at the same time. Well, that was a lot, but hopefully now you have a pretty good idea of what it takes to IGL, at least within the ranked atmosphere. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe and feel free to watch it back whenever you need a small refresher. Thanks for watching, and I will see you all in the next one.